Good morning, all. My name is Dr. Ikenna Okpave Onya. I am a senior lecturer in School of General Studies, Michael Okpara University, Umudike. This semester, the title of the course I am to teach you is Nigerian History, and the code is JSS 112. We look at the background why we must study Nigerian history. And we said that Nigerian history is one of the general courses approved by the University Senate of Michael Okpara University. To the founding fathers of the university, they feel that our students should have great knowledge of history. Not only history, the founding fathers also felt that our graduates will not only be attending conferences in Anglophone countries alone. Thus, they also introduced French, elementary French in our general studies. They also introduced German, elementary German in our general courses. We come back to history, Nigerian history. Why our students must have great knowledge of Nigerian history. We say that a great knowledge of Nigerian history will help our students not only to know, but to correct the wrong assertions by Eurocentric historians that Nigeria and other sub-Saharan African nations never had any history until the arrival of the Europeans in Africa. Commenting on this Eurocentric bias against Africa, Professor Ali Mazuru said that Africa had suffered four great deniers. He mentioned number one as denial of history, number two, denial of science, number three, denial of poetry, and number four, denial of philosophy. For instance, the denial of Africa not having any knowledge of history is best illustrated by the notorious statement of Professor Hugh Trovarupa, a renowned Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford University, England, in responding to the student demand for some courses in African history to be added in their curriculum. Let's look at the slide and see what Professor Trevorupa said as recent as 1963. Look at what the professor said about Africa. Let's look at the slide and see what he said. He said, perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach, but as at present, there is none. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. To study African history before the coming of the Europeans was to pry into the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. Therefore, to correct this stereotype the Europeans have about Nigeria and Africans in general, the major reason why we must study Nigerian history includes, number one, the study in Nigerian history will sharpen our understanding of the history of Nigerians' ethnic groups by showing that Nigerians had unifying factors in their history even before the colonial rules. Two, the study of Nigerian history is beneficial since it will help students acquire knowledge about Nigerian traditions, culture, norms, and values to take pride in them. Point number three, the study of history will inculcate in our students the habit of not accepting explanations on the face value. For proper understanding of this course, we shall break the topics into chapters, which is also known as course outline. Let's look at the course outline and briefly see what we are going to learn in this course. In chapter 1, we are going to look at the meaning, nature, and scope of history. In chapter 2, we look at the land and the people of Nigeria. Chapter 3, we will consider or look at the topic centers of ancient civilization in Nigeria. In this chapter 3, remember that the Europeans say that Africans and Nigerians never had any civilization. It is in this chapter 3 that we look at some of the centers of ancient civilization that occurred in Nigeria. We look at sites like the Nok culture in Kaduna. We look at Igbo in Anambra State. We look at Ife culture in Osun State. We look at Benin culture in Edo State. In chapter 4, we look at the traditions of origin of the people of Nigeria. In chapter 5, we will look at the early external influences, the Europeans and the Arabs' contacts with the people of Nigeria. In this chapter 5, we will look at the first contact the Nigerian people had with outsiders. In southern Nigeria, Nigerian people or the people of Nigeria encountered the Europeans through the Gulf of Guinea, and the first town they entered was Benin in Edo State. In the north, the Arabs had contact with many states, kingdoms, and empires in northern Nigeria. Chapter 5 will take care of the external contact with the outsiders or foreigners. In chapter 6, we look at the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio and the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate. In this chapter 6, we will look at the area called Northern Nigeria now, how the Hausa states were before the emergence of Usman Dan Fodio and the establishment of the Caliphate. In chapter 7, we look at Nigeria and the transatlantic slave trade. We look at the origin of this slave. We look at the organization of the trade. We look at the abolition and the impact the slave trade had on the people of Nigeria. In chapter 8, we look at the European exploration of the Niger River. You remember that most Europeans that came to Nigeria confined themselves at the coastal area. They did not enter the hinterland or the interior, but after the exploration of the river Niger in 1830, which was solved, or the mystery associated with the river Niger was solved in 1830 by the two brothers, Richard and John. In this chapter 8, we will look at the activities of the Europeans at the interior. In chapter 9, we consider the topic, the growth of the legitimate trade in Nigeria. In chapter 10, we look at Christian missions in Nigeria. The activities of the Christian missions in Nigeria will be discussed in this chapter 10. Chapter 11, we look at the British conquest of Nigeria. We started with the conquest of Lagos in 1851. 10 years after, Lagos was annexed. Thus, it became a crown colony. In chapter 12, we look at the British colonial administration in Nigeria. Remember, Britain, having conquered Nigeria, introduced different administration. The people in Lagos were regarded as a crown colony. They also had what we call the protectorate. They also had what we call trust territory. Trust territory was the colonial possession of Germans. When Germany lost the First World War, German possession in West Africa were taken away from them. In chapter 13, we look at nationalism and the formation of political parties in Nigeria. In this chapter 13, we look at the factors that led to the emergence of nationalism in Nigeria. In chapter 14, we look at constitutional development in Nigeria. Chapter 15, we will look at Nigerian federalism. Lastly, we look at chapter 16 with the topic Nigeria since independence. In this chapter 16, we consider the development that had occurred in Nigeria since 1960 when Nigeria had their independence. Next week, when we'll be looking at chapter 1 with the title Meaning, Nation and Scope of, we will ask ourselves, what is history? What are the branches of history? Thank you.